The modern mind, conditioned by an age of neural imaging and pharmaceutical intervention, believes it has cornered the market on understanding human consciousness. Yet beneath the veneer of contemporary psychology lies an ancient skeleton, a philosophical framework so profound that its influence permeates every major school of psychological thought, from Freud to Jung, from transpersonal psychology to cognitive behavioral therapy. This skeleton is Hermeticism, the esoteric tradition attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice great sage whose teachings have survived millennia not through institutional preservation, but through their fundamental resonance with the architecture of human consciousness itself. The question is not whether Hermeticism influenced modern psychology. The evidence is overwhelming and documented. The question is why this influence has been systematically obscured, relegated to footnotes, and dismissed as mere historical curiosity by a discipline desperate to appear scientific, empirical, untainted by mystical association. This erasure is itself worthy of analysis, for it reveals psychology's deep anxiety about its own origins, its need to distance itself from the very wells of wisdom that gave it birth. When Carl Jung spent years studying alchemical texts, when he populated his theories with mandalas and symbols drawn directly from Hermetic tradition, was he engaged in quaint antiquarianism or recognizing something essential? When contemporary neuroscience discovers that meditation alters brain structure, that visualization techniques affect physiological processes, that consciousness itself remains fundamentally mysterious despite all our instruments, are these discoveries or rediscoveries? The seeker who approaches Hermeticism today is not diving into superstition, but confronting the possibility that ancient wisdom traditions understood psychological principles that modernity has only begun to rediscover, often clumsily, through the narrow lens of materialist assumption. Hermeticism rests upon a corpus of texts, primarily the 17 tractates of the Corpus Hermeticum, and the Emerald Tablet, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, a syncretic figure combining the Greek Hermes and Egyptian Thoth. Scholarly consensus dates these texts to the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, products of the fertile intellectual soil of Hellenistic Egypt, where Greek philosophy, Egyptian mysticism, and emerging Gnostic thought interpenetrated. But the tradition claims far greater antiquity, positioning itself as Prisca Theologia, the original theology from which all wisdom traditions descended. The historical debate over dating and authorship, while academically important, misses the philosophical point. What matters is not whether a singular historical Hermes existed, but whether the principles articulated in these texts possess explanatory and transformative power. And here, the answer is unequivocal. The central doctrine of Hermeticism, as above so below, as within so without, is not mystical obscurantism, but a precise formulation of what modern psychology would later call isomorphism, the recognition that patterns repeat across scales, that the structure of the psyche mirrors the structure of reality itself. The Seven Hermetic Principles, most accessibly articulated in the Kybalion of 1908, provide a systematic framework. First, the principle of mentalism. The all is mind, the universe is mental. This is not naive idealism denying material reality, but a sophisticated recognition that consciousness is primary, that all our experiences of reality are mediated through and potentially constructed by mind. Modern neuroscience, with its demonstrations that perception is active construction rather than passive reception, has arrived at remarkably similar conclusions through different methodology. Second, the principle of correspondence establishes the fractal nature of reality. Patterns recur from the cosmic to the atomic, from the social to the psychological. When Jung identified archetypes appearing across cultures and eras, when systems theorists recognize that families, organizations, and ecosystems display analogous structures, they were rediscovering hermetic correspondence. Third, the principle of vibration posits that nothing rests. All is in motion. All is energy manifesting at different frequencies. Contemporary physics has validated this literally. Matter is indeed condensed energy. Solidity is an illusion created by electromagnetic forces. But the psychological application is equally profound. Emotional states, thought patterns, Entire personality structures can be understood as vibrational frequencies, some conducive to growth and integration, others to fragmentation and pathology. The principle of polarity states that opposites are identical in nature but different in degree, that all paradoxes can be reconciled. This anticipates dialectical thinking, Hegel's thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and psychological concepts like Jung's enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposites. The principle of rhythm recognizes cyclical patterns, the pendulum swing between states that characterizes both natural phenomena and psychological processes. The principle of cause and effect denies randomness, asserting that every effect has a cause, that chance is merely a term for unrecognized causation. Determinism versus free will, a debate that has consumed philosophy for millennia, finds in Hermeticism a nuanced position. One becomes free not by denying causation, but by rising to higher causal planes, by making the unconscious conscious, as Freud would later phrase it. Finally, the principle of gender identifies masculine and feminine energies present in all things, not as literal biological sex, but as archetypal principles, active and receptive, penetrating and encompassing, logos and eros. That Jung independently identified animus and anima, that contemporary psychology recognizes agency and communion as fundamental dimensions of personality, testifies to the principle's validity. These principles are not mystical assertions requiring faith, but philosophical hypotheses, inviting empirical testing through lived experience. The Hermetic system is fundamentally practical, oriented not toward belief but toward gnosis, direct experiential knowledge obtained through disciplined inner work. What makes these principles psychologically sophisticated is their recognition that apparent contradictions exist only at lower levels of analysis. The Hermetic adept learns to hold paradox, to recognize that truth and falsehood, good and evil, subject and object are complementary polarities rather than absolute opposites. This capacity for paradoxical thinking, for what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainties, mysteries and doubts without irritable reaching after fact and reason, is precisely what depth psychology identifies as psychological maturity. The principles also provide a diagnostic framework. When an individual experiences psychological suffering, the hermetically informed analyst asks, which principle is being violated? Is the person identified with one pole of a polarity, denying its complement? Are they resisting natural rhythms, trying to maintain a static state in a reality characterized by flux? Have they mistaken a lower causal plane for ultimate reality, failing to recognize the deeper patterns generating their circumstances? This framework reveals that most psychological pathology stems from fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of reality and consciousness. Depression often reflects violation of the principle of rhythm, the refusal to accept that emotional states naturally oscillate, the belief that current darkness is permanent. Anxiety frequently involves misunderstanding of the principle of cause and effect, feeling victimized by circumstances while failing to recognize one's own causal participation in their arising. Addiction represents a particularly clear example of violating multiple Hermetic principles. The addict has mistaken a lower vibrational state for satisfaction, has become identified with one pole of a polarity, pleasure-seeking, while denying its complement, pain acceptance, and has lost connection with the mental principle, the recognition that consciousness can choose its relationship to craving rather than being enslaved by it. The Hermetic path is a systematic process of transformation, what depth psychology would later term individuation. It begins with a recognition that ordinary consciousness is a kind of sleep, that most humans live in what the Hermeticists called ignorance, not mere lack of information, but a fundamental misidentification with the false self, the persona constructed from social conditioning, defensive patterns, and identification with the transient. The first stage is awakening to this condition, what might be called metanoia, a shift in perspective that reveals one's previous understanding as partial, distorted. This is invariably precipitated by crisis. The structures one has relied upon for meaning fail. The narratives one has told about oneself collapse under scrutiny. In contemporary therapeutic language, this is the moment when defense mechanisms prove inadequate to protect against existential anxiety, when the ego's strategies for maintaining coherence break down. Hermeticism offers a map for navigating this breakdown. The aspirant is instructed to engage in self-study, not casual introspection, but rigorous examination of one's automaticity, one's mechanical patterns of thought and reaction. The Hermetic dictum, "Know thyself," borrowed from the Delphic oracle, is operationalized through practices that modern psychology would recognize: systematic self-observation, journaling, meditation, active imagination. But Hermeticism adds a dimension often absent from contemporary therapeutic approaches: the recognition that self-knowledge must be pursued within a cosmological framework, that understanding oneself requires understanding one's relationship to the larger whole. This is where the principle, "as above, so below," becomes practically essential. To know the microcosm of the psyche, one must study the macrocosm of nature, cosmos, archetypal patterns. The second stage involves purification, the alchemical process of separating the subtle from the gross, the essential from the accidental. In psychological terms, this is shadow work, confronting the repressed, denied, projected aspects of self. Jung explicitly acknowledged his debt to alchemical symbolism here, recognizing that the alchemist's obsession with transmuting base metals into gold was, on its deepest level, a symbolic representation of psychological transformation. Purification is not comfortable. It requires confronting one's complicity in one's own suffering, recognizing that the very defenses erected for protection have become prisons. The Hermetic texts speak of descending into darkness, entering the nigredo or blackening phase of alchemy. Therapeutically, this corresponds to what existential analysts call the dark night of the soul, when all meaning structures dissolve and one confronts the groundlessness of existence. This stage cannot be rushed or circumvented. Contemporary psychology's tendency toward quick fixes, toward symptom reduction rather than transformation, represents a fundamental betrayal of the depth required for genuine change. The Hermetic tradition insists that descent precedes ascent, that dissolution precedes reconstitution, that the false self must die before the true self can emerge. The third stage is illumination, the influx of gnosis that occurs when the purified consciousness becomes receptive to higher understanding. In Hermetic terms, this is the moment when the nous, the divine intellect, awakens within the individual. Jung called it the encounter with the self, the archetype of wholeness that transcends and integrates the ego. Maslow termed it peak experience. Transpersonal psychology speaks of cosmic consciousness. The language differs, but the phenomenon remains remarkably consistent across traditions and eras. A direct experience of unity, of one's essential nature as consciousness itself rather than the contents of consciousness. This is not belief or conceptual understanding, but immediate knowing, as undeniable as one's own existence. Crucially, Hermeticism insists that illumination is not the end point, but the foundation for the final stage, integration and manifestation. The awakened individual must return to ordinary reality transformed, embodying wisdom in action. The Hermetic adept becomes what later traditions would call a bodhisattva or a sage, one who has achieved liberation but remains engaged with the world, working to alleviate suffering and spread understanding. This stage addresses a common pitfall in both spiritual and psychological development: spiritual bypassing, the use of transcendent experiences to avoid engaging with practical, relational, embodied existence. Hermeticism's principle of correspondence demands that inner transformation manifest as outer change, that psychological integration produces tangible effects in one's relationships, work, and service to the world. The entire journey operates according to what Hermeticism calls the law of octaves. Development proceeds not linearly, but in spirals, each circuit deepening and refining understanding. One does not complete the journey and arrive at a static endpoint, rather one engages in continuous refinement, each turn of the spiral revealing new depths, new subtleties. This maps precisely onto contemporary developmental psychology's recognition that growth continues throughout the lifespan, that each stage of life presents new challenges and opportunities for integration. The Hermetic framework simply provides a more comprehensive map, one that extends development beyond conventional psychological maturity into realms that Western psychology has only recently begun to acknowledge through transpersonal and integral models. What distinguishes the Hermetic approach from both conventional religion and secular psychology is its methodology. Unlike religion, it does not demand faith in unprovable assertions, but invites empirical investigation through disciplined inner work. Unlike conventional psychology, it does not reduce consciousness to neural mechanisms, but recognizes consciousness as the fundamental reality within which all experience, including neuroscience itself, occurs. The practices themselves are remarkably practical. Meditation in the Hermetic tradition is not escape from the world, but refined attention to it. The practitioner learns to witness thought without identification, to observe emotional reactivity without being consumed by it, to recognize the difference between the content of consciousness and consciousness itself. This is precisely what contemporary mindfulness-based interventions have rediscovered, often without acknowledging their debt to ancient contemplative traditions. Active imagination, a technique Jung borrowed explicitly from alchemical Hermeticism, involves dialoguing with autonomous complexes, personified aspects of the psyche. This is not psychosis, but sophisticated psychological technology, a method for making the unconscious conscious, for integrating dissociated material. The Hermetic texts are filled with such dialogues, Hermes conversing with Poimandres, the divine nous, modeling a process that remains therapeutically powerful millennia later. The study of symbols, correspondences, and analogies trains the psyche to think in terms of relationships and patterns, rather than discrete objects and linear causation. This is the kind of thinking that complexity science and systems theory now recognize as essential for understanding emergent phenomena, whether in ecosystems, economies, or the psyche itself. The Hermetic adept was engaging in systems thinking centuries before the term existed. Moreover, the Hermetic emphasis on direct experience over received doctrine creates a natural safeguard against dogmatism and cult dynamics that plague many spiritual movements. One is instructed to test every teaching against the laboratory of one's own experience, to verify rather than believe. This is the scientific attitude applied to inner development, and it explains why Hermeticism has inspired genuine seekers while frustrating those seeking external authority, to relieve them of the burden of their own freedom. Every genuine transformative journey encounters what the mystics called the dark night, and what existential psychology recognizes as the confrontation with absurdity, groundlessness, the void. This is not incidental to the path, but essential, for it is precisely in this crisis that the false securities dissolve and the possibility of authentic being emerges. The Hermetic texts are unflinching in their acknowledgement of this crisis. The Corpus Hermeticum describes the soul's descent into matter as a fall into forgetting, into identification with the body and its passions. This is not moral judgment, but phenomenological description, the observation that ordinary consciousness is characterized by fragmentation, by the experience of being divided against oneself, driven by compulsions one cannot fully understand or control. Modern psychology has extensively catalogued the symptoms of this condition: anxiety, depression, addiction, personality disorders, the entire spectrum of human suffering that brings individuals to therapy. But mainstream psychology often treats these as discrete pathologies to be managed, rather than recognizing them as manifestations of a more fundamental crisis, the crisis of meaning in a disenchanted world. Hermeticism contextualizes individual suffering within a cosmological framework. The soul is in crisis because it has forgotten its divine origin, identified with the perishable, mistaken the finite for the infinite. This is not metaphysical speculation, but a hypothesis that can be tested. Does the experience of existential crisis include the sense of having lost something essential, of being alienated from one's true nature? The crisis deepens when the seeker begins the work of purification, and encounters the full extent of what Jung called the shadow, the repository of everything one has denied, repressed, projected onto others. This is where many spiritual aspirants and therapy clients alike falter, for the shadow contains not only unacceptable impulses, but also profound truths about one's actual motivations, the gap between one's self-image and one's behavior. Hermeticism offers a crucial insight here. The shadow must be integrated, not destroyed. The alchemical process does not eliminate the lead, but transforms it into gold. Psychologically, this means that the energy bound up in repression, in maintaining false self-concepts, becomes available for consciousness when shadow material is acknowledged and integrated. But integration requires confronting what Kierkegaard called anxiety and Heidegger called angst, the groundless ground of existence, the recognition that there is no ultimate external authority, no cosmic guarantee, no predetermined essence that defines who one must be. This is the existential dimension of the dark night, and it is here that many seek refuge in premature closure, in new belief systems, in spiritual materialism that replaces genuine transformation with the accumulation of experiences and credentials. The Hermetic tradition is adamant: one must pass through the void, not around it. The dissolution must be complete. Every certainty, every identity, every conception of self must be surrendered in the alchemical solve, the dissolving, before the coagula, the reconstitution, can occur at a higher level. This is perhaps where Hermeticism most radically challenges contemporary psychology's therapeutic goals. The aim is not adjustment to society, not the resolution of symptoms, not even happiness as conventionally understood. The aim is metanoia, the complete transformation of consciousness, the death of the ego-identified self and the birth of awareness rooted in the transpersonal. Such transformation is necessarily devastating to the structures of ordinary identity. It explains why genuine spiritual emergence is often pathologized as psychotic breakdown, why transformative crisis is medicated rather than midwifed. The Hermetic framework allows for discernment. Not all breakdown is breakthrough, but all breakthrough involves breakdown of previous structures. The crisis of the soul, then, is both danger and opportunity. It is the crucible in which transformation occurs, the nigrido from which the philosopher's stone emerges. To medicalize it away, to return to functioning without fundamental transformation, is to miss the evolutionary imperative encoded in the crisis itself. When the crisis is navigated with awareness and courage, when the descent into darkness is followed through to its nadir, a fundamental shift occurs. What Hermeticism calls the birth of the divine nous, Jung termed individuation, and what contemporary transpersonal psychology recognizes as self-realization. This is not the acquisition of new content, but the recognition of what was always already the case, one's essential nature as consciousness itself, the awareness within which all experience arises. The integrated individual embodies the Hermetic maxim in lived reality. The microcosm of the psyche has been consciously aligned with the macrocosm of universal principles. The fractures within consciousness have been healed not through repression, but through integration. What was unconscious has been made conscious. What was fragmented has been made whole. This manifests concretely in several domains. First, in relationship to oneself, there is what the Buddhists call non-attachment, and what psychology recognizes as the capacity to observe one's thoughts and emotions without being enslaved by them. The integrated individual experiences desires, fears, the full spectrum of human feeling, but is not identified with these passing states. There is a center of gravity that remains stable through life's vicissitudes. Second, in relationship to others, integration produces what Carl Rogers called unconditional positive regard and what spiritual traditions recognize as compassion. Having confronted and integrated one's own shadow, one naturally extends this acceptance to others, recognizing in their struggles the universal human condition. Projection ceases. One sees others as they are rather than through the distorting lens of one's own unresolved material. Third, in relationship to work and calling, integration manifests as what the Hermetic tradition calls the great work. The alignment of personal will with universal will, the discovery and embodiment of one's unique function in the cosmic order. This is not grandiosity, but its opposite, the recognition that each individual consciousness is a necessary note in the cosmic symphony, that one's specific gifts and struggles equip one for a specific contribution. Fourth, in relationship to meaning and death, integration provides what Frankl called the tragic optimism, the capacity to affirm life despite its suffering, to find meaning in the face of mortality. The integrated individual has died before dying, has confronted the void, and emerged not with denial but with acceptance, even celebration of existence as it is. But Hermeticism insists that integration is never complete, that the journey continues through ever-refining spirals. The awakened individual does not graduate from the human condition, but engages it more fully, more consciously. There is no arrival, only deepening participation in the great mystery. This stands in stark contrast to both religious fundamentalism's promise of final salvation and secular psychology's goal of cure. Hermeticism offers instead an ongoing practice, a way of being that continuously transforms limitation into opportunity, suffering into wisdom, ignorance into gnosis. The practical implications are profound. The hermetically informed individual approaches life as alchemical laboratory, each challenge as opportunity for refinement, each relationship as mirror for self-understanding. Meditation, contemplation, active imagination become daily practices not for achieving altered states, but for cultivating presence. Ethics emerge not from external commandment, but from recognition of interconnection, from seeing one's own face in every other. Contemporary psychology is beginning to rediscover these principles through mindfulness-based interventions, through acceptance and commitment therapy, through the growing recognition that symptom reduction without meaning-making leaves individuals functional but hollow. The integration of ancient wisdom with empirical methodology represents not regression to mysticism, but evolution toward a more comprehensive understanding of human potential. The laboratory stretches before you, alembics gleaming with reflected light, elements awaiting combination. But remember this: the prima materia you seek to transform is not found in exotic texts or distant temples, but in the raw matter of your own unexamined life, and the fire that transmutes lead into gold burns brightest in the furnace of relentless self-inquiry.